Good evening, everyone, and good morning for everyone in Asia. Ohayo gozaimasu, annyeonghaseyo, ni hao, japabue, all of you from the countries we're discussing. I'm Yves Tiberghien, co-director of the Center for Japanese Research, and a board member for the CJR, the Korea Center. And it's really a great pleasure welcoming all of you tonight. To start, I would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, for most of us at UBC, and in my case, the Wesleyan Coast Salish people. And it's particularly salient today, given how much we have to relearn from First Nation people about the relationship to the environment. I'll start also by thanking Saya-san, Lisa, and Yeonju, the three research assistants of the three centers, as well as the three directors, Tim Cheek, Ross King, and myself, for this joint event. This is a rare joint event by the three centers, CKR, CCR, and CJR. And it's wonderful that the environment brought us together. I also, of course, thank all the editors and authors from the book that we are celebrating today for joining, and also welcome all of you, the audience, and we welcome a very active discussion together. So today's topic is a discussion around a wonderful book that just came out and fascinating development in East Asia. The book's title is Greening East Asia. And the topic, of course, is a new development of environmentalism and innovation in environmental policy in East Asia. Particularly interesting to do this today, when this fall alone, Japan, Korea, and China all came up with carbon neutrality pledges by 2050 or 2060. The chat function has been disabled. The questions should be asked to the Q&A window. So we ask you to use the Q&A window. Please note that this webinar and the Q&A session will be recorded. You're not required to use your camera or microphone to participate in a Q&A session. Written questions can be submitted to everyone via the Q&A function and upvoted by you. I will monitor the Q&A window and post questions using attendees' first names only, unless you pick the anonymous function. And we'll do the Q&A in the sort of the last half hour of this event. So I won't spend time introducing every author and every editor. There were 4 editors for this book, but you're going to see them as I'm going to start a conversation with the editors, and then we'll bring all more authors into the discussion. I'm going to ask each editor when they speak first to maybe quickly introduce themselves. So let's begin the story of this very special book. And I'll start with the first question is, how did the book come out? This idea come out, and what was the origin of it? And maybe I'll turn to Stevan first, and then you'll ask the next person. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Yves, and thanks to all the directors and to the administrators for setting up this great opportunity for us. And having said that, I'm going to hand off to Ashley because he started it.
Mm. Oh, thanks, Steve. But you were the towering force behind it all at almost every stage. Yeah, this project was inspired by a time that I was spending in Alberta's wild places. For those of you who don't know Alberta, it's famous for beautiful mountains and national parks like Banff and Jasper and biodiverse prairies. But it also has a really large energy sector that emphasizes the production of oil and gas, the former primarily bitumen or tar sands. And we've got oil wells all over the prairies and natural gas extraction throughout the foothills. And I'm an avid hiker and fisherman, a backcountry hunter. I moved to Canada a few years ago, hoping to experience North America's disappearing wilderness. And I remember mentioning this to my then department chair, and he said, "There's no wilderness left." And it seemed that wherever I went, there was this tremendous impact of energy and forestry sectors. And the further I got from cities, the more activity I saw on logging roads and remote camps. And as a scholar of East Asian politics, I began to wonder whether North America or Alberta had something to learn from East Asia, where I had lived for a number of years. East Asian countries had impressed me with their history of rapid economic growth, despite relatively few natural resources. And they use these resources generally quite efficiently. And in addition, due to population densities, the environmental cost of post-war developmentalism led to really serious air and water pollution that were visible to everyone. This is an argument that Steve develops in the book, the importance of visibility for people taking action about environmental issues. And in Alberta, it's really easy for Edmontonians and Calgarians to go about their life making the occasional visit to a national park without encountering the environmental devastation caused by energy and forestry sectors. But in Taiwan in the 1990s, where I lived, or Shanghai in the 2000s, everyone felt the effects of air pollution in their lungs or in their eyes. I remember living in Taipei and not knowing that the city was ringed by beautiful hills that had great hiking trails. And then when I was a jogger in Shanghai, the air seemed indistinguishable from like a smoke-filled bar room. And it didn't matter what people's occupation was or what their views were on politics. People wanted something done about the environment. And gradually a sense of public urgency about making life sustainable for humans, as well as other species, while continuing to grow the economy, prompted reflection by a range of actors and social activists whose interests were, our book argues, importantly, often aligned. And this led to a gradual shift in priorities at the local, national, and regional levels toward forms of development that were greener and cleaner for the environment. Also, as I was thinking about the beginnings of this project while tromping around Alberta's mountains, I sort of had in the back of my mind a book by Ezra Vogel, Japan is Number One, Lessons for America. And among other things, that book helped to explain the causes of Japan's economic boom and its efficient use of resources. And I wondered, might not a study of East Asia's environmental turn help people outside the region, consider the prospects for development that's more sustainable and maybe, just maybe, inspire more thinking that could help save a few Alberta caribou herds? Okay, that's a stretch. Going beyond my interest in saving the caribou, East Asian environmentalism has important significance for the future of the Earth. First, East Asia's environmental impact is arguably the world's largest, and addressing the region's environmental problems is crucial to building sustainability for the Earth as a whole. Second, East Asia having increased its affluence after much of Europe and North America, but before South Asia, parts of Latin America, and most of Africa can serve as an example for countries likely to increase resource consumption in the coming decades. So my problem as a scholar who wanted to do something like start this new project was that I didn't know very much about environmental politics or environmentalism. I'd read books by Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein, but it didn't go much further than that. I needed help. Fortunately, I had a hiking buddy named Steve Harrell, who knew a lot about the environment and environmentalism in East Asia, and that became the title of a conference that I would host in Banff. I leaned on Steve for suggestions about who we might invite to the conference, and perhaps because the location was such a nice one, we had the conference in June, it led to lots of luminaries deciding to attend, and in hopes of generating new insights, we started with a very large, diverse group, journalists who'd worked in post-Fukushima Japan, Taiwanese environmental activists, South Korean nuclear scientists, anthropologists, sociologists, scholars of urban planning, and political scientists. And as you might expect, at the conference, our exchanges were sometimes a little heated, as I recall, mostly between the activists and the nuclear scientists. Then it took a while for the editors, the people who'd become the editors of this book, myself, Mary Alice Haddad, Joanna Lewis, and Steve, to craft a conceptual framework, one that we call eco-developmentalism, that connected and explained the findings of some 20 contributors writing about the region, where environmental protection is seen as requisite and sustainable development is associated with new opportunities. So taken as a whole, the book's 15 chapters highlight the ways in which governments, activists, and indigenous communities have attempted to ameliorate environmental challenges in China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And they've done so through seeking changes in law and policy, local activism, and by founding environmental NGOs and working with partners in government. That's really important. Additionally, the book examines some of the outcomes of these efforts, and that speaks to Steve's contribution in his excellent concluding chapter.
That was great, Ashley. Any addition by some of the other editors?
Well, I think the interesting thing, and I'm actually hoping that both Mary Alice and Laurie might chime in here if you feel like it, is that we did have as Ashley mentioned, at the conference at Banff, a hugely diverse group of people from different countries, different genders, different age groups, different professions, different disciplines, but also, frankly, different qualities of work, and different degrees of relevance to some kind of coherent topic. And so, in fact, looking through the chapters that are not by us for editors, only about half of them are from people who were actually there at the conference, and including Yves was brought in later on at Mary Alice's suggestion, and several of the other people. Dan was there, Chung Ho was there, Rob was there, but a lot of people weren't, and so to move from a conference to a book was a bit of a challenge. What should we keep and what should we not keep? Of course, there's always the problem of telling the people that you're not keeping why you're not keeping them, but that's a political and emotional rather than a scholarly problem. And but coming up with this idea of eco-developmentalism, which I think we can talk about a little bit more in a minute. As Ashley said, we all knew what it was, but we didn't know what to call it. Laurie, I think you'll remember that when you sent this book to one of the peer reviewers in our first iteration, they sent it back and said, you got some good stuff here, but it's really not together. What's this book about? What is it for? And Laurie was very kind and said, she thought that there was some merit here. It didn't just reject it out of hand, but you guys, get your act together before we send it to the second peer reviewer. And so this is when we really had to think about what really theme, not just what are people in East Asia doing about the environment, which is, is fun, but it's, it's a topic, but it's not a book. And we kind of knew there was this switch that had happened or partial switch that had happened in the 4 countries that we cover. And I should mention just here, I made some fishing expeditions to try to get an article on North Korea. And the one person who was tempted felt like it was too dangerous for him, even under a pseudonym, because he wanted to be able to go back. So we didn't have an article on North Korea. Anyway, that the 4 countries had all gone through a kind of a process. They had all been the sort of classical East Asian developmental states that people like Ezra Vogel, like Chalmers Johnson, others of these giants of the past have talked about. And at various times, depending on the degree of material improvement or material standard of living, and also depending on a bunch of political factors, and I'll let my other editors talk about that because I'm the only non-political scientist on the editorial committee. But they all made a kind of a 90-degree turn toward considering that if we are going to continue developing and continue to improve the material life of the people in our country, we're going to have to start paying attention to the environment, because the environment is really dirty, really awful. And this realization came in Japan with the 2 poisoning cases, Minamata and the Itai disease in the late 50s, and it came in Taiwan and Korea in the 1990s, and really came in China at the end of the 1990s. And the event that I like to point to is the 1998 floods in the central Yangtze region. but you can point to other events that was happening, you know, but that was really kind of a trigger. And so that they moved from being this sort of classical developmental states to being something that was also taking care of the environment at the same time, and even realizing that environmental remediation and environmental mitigation was going to be necessary if they were going to actually continue developing in the material or the GDP sense or the urban consumption sense. And so what do we call this? And then Ashley was teaching a class, and I'll let you take it from there.
I was teaching a class, and we had 2 or 3 different titles for this concept of eco-developmentalism, and none of them seemed to be really good for, you know, the editors. And I just kind of threw it out to the students and said, you know, these are the ideas we have. Meet in small groups, talk about it. What do you think? This was my introduction to Chinese politics class, and a student named Riley Coulter Krause came up with this idea of eco-developmentalism, and we just loved the ring of it. You know, we were able to then adapt this word to just what we've been thinking about in terms of the changes these East Asian societies were making.
The other part of the process that I shouldn't have left out, but Mary Alice, maybe you can say something about this, is, you know, Ashley was in charge of the conference. I remember I gave my talk on June 4th, and so I wore my Tank Man t-shirt, you know, which you don't usually give a talk even at a conference in the mountains in just a ragged old t-shirt. But anyway, I wore my Tank Man t-shirt in the honor of June 4th, and Ashley asked me if I would like to edit a book. We were up somewhere above Lake Louise, I think, when we talked about this. And I said, yeah, but let's ask Mary Alice and Joanna to co-edit with us. So it wasn't decided ahead of time that the 4 of us were going to edit a book. Basically, Ashley had a conference, and then we started accreting people who had different levels or different areas of expertise, both in terms of skills and in terms of knowledge. And that's why the 4 of us ended up as the editors.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for Mary Alice, actually, maybe, and then others can follow, which is trying to get to the big punchline of the book. It essentially looks like, as you mentioned, all 4 East Asian cases here end up taking leadership, really making major changes. So is there an East Asian approach to this, you know, if we compare all the cases? And we know that 3 of the 4 right now, Korea, Japan, and China, just made carbon neutrality pledges, 2050 for Japan and Korea, 2060 for China, all in September. So is it a moment where we find an East Asian model, you know, taking the lead toward the future green economy of the world? And what's driving it? You know, it's at the aggregate level. Then we'll move to the cases and knowing what's more specific about each case. But
so that's a great question, Yves. And one of the things that's really cool about the book is that as someone who does comparative politics, it's the East Asian countries are really, really different. They're like big and small and more democratic and not at all democratic and sort of newly democratic. And some have largely one-party systems and others have really, you know, super dynamic and competitive 2-party systems. And so what did not happen is the classic stories that we have of progressive environmental policy did not happen in East Asia. So we did not see big social movements pushing it. We did not see sort of a big brother EU government like having an aha moment and guiding everybody in some way, in some technocratic way. We did not see those things. We didn't have a Green Party that kind of revolutionized everything. So the thing that we've seen drive environmental policy elsewhere is not what was really driving it in East Asia. And across the whole region, we did see this sort of trajectory, as Steve sort of alluded to, where first you had this horrible industrial pollution caused by rapid economic development. Then you had citizen pressure on the governments who felt like the government was responsible for human health. And we see a sort of echo of this happening under the COVID moment, right? Where citizens across East Asia, even whether they're from a democratic country or non-democratic country, believe that the government should make sure that people don't die and that the government is responsible for that in some way. And then the government felt responsible for it. And so they felt that pressure, irrespective of the political system that they were in. They felt the pressure from the citizens to respond to this environmental crisis. And then on top of all of that, and the thing that I think that really sets East Asia apart in some way and also offers it as a good model for other places is that businesses had an epiphany. And the epiphany was that it is not the case that environmentally good products are bad business, and that environmentally good policies are bad for business. In fact, it's the opposite of that. I think in the current moment, like you're saying to, the 2050 commitments, there is a recognition across East Asia at a sort of macro level in both the government and in especially big business, but business in general, that in 2050, you cannot have an anti-environmental business, because if climate change goes on its current trajectory, there will be no business in 2050, or business that we know it. No businesses will be making money if they are running in an anti-environmental way. So you have to have pro-climate businesses in operation in 2050. And that means for East Asia and actually the world, the countries and the businesses that can develop processes and products that help make that shift to a low carbon, more sustainable world, they are going to do well. They're going to do well. It's a win-win. So the people will win, the planet will win, the businesses will win, the governments will win. So it's a win-win for everybody. And so I think that is why we're seeing even the diverse political systems that we've seen in East Asia sort of converge around this idea that there does need to be, net neutral climate policy, and that not every business likes it, and not every business has the same idea of how to get there. But at a sort of broad sense, there's an alignment in the government, in business, and in society that's the trajectory where everybody needs to go. And so there's rough alignment along all three of the sectors to get folks there.
That's great. Yeah. Ashley or Steven, anything to add on this? Broad East Asia story. Mm-hmm. No?
I think Mary Alice really captured it well. It's recognizing that eco-development is an opportunity. That is the real shift. And that brings together politicians in these different governments. It brings together activists, and it brings together business. And when you've got these three interests lining up, a lot of the time, even if not all of the time, that's really powerful. It's supported by public opinion. It's a bit like the old, the catch up with the West consensus in Japan that Gerald Curtis used to talk about when I was a student at Columbia. There's this sense that Japan had to catch up with the West. There was a consensus that reverberated throughout the political system and the bureaucracy. And I think you have a broad consensus that the environment needs to be considered when you embark on a new initiative, political or business, and even new construction needs to consider environmental issues to an extent. And so there's this broad kind of social consensus that affects politics and economic decisions at the top and at the bottom. And it's something that I think more societies around the world should be wrapping their heads around.
I guess sorry. I wanted to follow up, just lest it sound too Pollyannish. It's not the case that all of the areas of environmental progress are as easy. So there's some aspects of when the pro-environmental policy also generates profit, that's easy. And you're going to see a lot of that happening, sort of the green growth model. But there are places, and we had actually, in my view, the best stories in the book, written by many of the authors that are here, come from the work in environmental justice. And that's harder work, because environmental justice work often isn't profit producing. And so it's not quite as amenable to the eco-developmental state model. And so although there are some areas of pro-environmental policy that I think are really easy for a developmental state or an eco-developmental state to accomplish, there are also other areas that lag. And when it's disempowered people or marginalized people or indigenous people that aren't making a ton of money, that area becomes a lot harder to see what we would consider progress when those are the environmental issues that you're trying to be concerned about.
In my concluding article in the book on environmental Kuznets curve, I talked about where it works and where it doesn't. And the turn to eco-developmentalism is not exactly the same as the environmental Kuznets curve, because the environmental Kuznets curve is just much more mechanistic and therefore not as good an explanation, but it's a good heuristic device. And there's several factors. If you take an aspect of environmental degradation and the corresponding necessity for, or at least desire for, mitigation, you find that a whole series of different factors are going to come into the equation of whether it works or not, and how quickly. And some of them are just physical. As I point out, you can fix air pollution. All you got to do is turn off the factories and stop the cars. Now, you're going to start them again for political and economic reasons, but there's no physical barrier to fixing air pollution. It goes away in a hurry. If you talk about something like biodiversity, once it's gone, it's gone. Nobody's ever revived an extinct species, even with CRISPR. And so there are some physical limitations and physical time periods. So climate change the climate will eventually be cold again. Probably take 4,000 or 5,000 years, and depends on the different irregularities in the Earth's orbit. But that's too long for us to worry about. It might as well be perpetual. And if you take something like soil pollution, it's the same thing. But another factor is, of course, how much public pressure is there on the regime and on the corporate actors to fix the problem. Another reason why air pollution is easy to fix is people go outside and they start coughing, their eyes start watering. Right away, there's pressure to fix air pollution. If it's soil pollution, well, not so much, because most people aren't farmers, especially, even in China now, only probably 20% of the people are farmers, and only 40% are rural. So, there's aspects of political pressure, public opinion, the economic feasibility, and also, of course, just the physical nature of the problem that all determine whether a ideological commitment to eco-developmentalism is actually going to turn out in reversing some of these harms to the environment.
Wonderful. I think that covers the broad picture and the similarities. So we should get now to some country stories and also get a sense of where it's working, where it's not working, some differences among the cases as we work through some of the stories. So would you suggest an order, Stevan or Mary Alice or Ashley, or do we just go by volunteers here?
Well, I think I'd like to hear each of our chapter authors here. We have Rob and Chung Ho and Dan and Jingyun. And I don't care about the order. I just whoever would like to go first. But I think it's important that you talk about, because all of you deal with very different things. Rob deals with school, and Chung Ho deals with a village and authoritarianism, and Dan deals with long-term resilience, and Jingyun deals with environmental NGOs. And so they're all very different cases, but maybe each of you could say something about how you think it fits into this overall theme.
Or if that's too hard, pick your favorite story from the field. Because the book's got great stories in it. It's not just, a bunch of academic mumbo jumbo.
I have my favorites, but I'd like the authors to talk about their own favorites. And why don't we just start with Rob?
Well, I don't know if I have a particularly vivid story right off the top of my head, but I should just introduce the theme of my contribution. My chapter is focused on the recent popularity of nature education, 自然教育, in China amongst urban middle-class Chinese primarily. And my interest in that topic is largely due to kind of a broader interest in what kind of childhood learning experiences motivate people to care for the more than human world, to become sort of adult environmentalists. And I had done, prior to the work that I did for this chapter, I'd spent about a decade in China looking at environmental education as it's practiced in public schools, and where it hasn't, in my view anyways, it's been a widespread, largely a failure for various reasons, including concern over exams and fear for the safety of children who were taken out on field trips to encounter firsthand the non-human world. And so with this kind of widespread failure as a backdrop, I was intrigued by the growing popularity of nature education, outdoor nature experiences that middle-class parents were willing to pay for and have their children participate in. And to me, the kind of central irony of this is that the reason why environmental education appears to have failed in public schools, and the reason why nature education appears to be successful or popular amongst certain sectors of the Chinese population is the same. Both derive from a concern not so much for the environment, but for the welfare and the well-being of children, oftentimes, in most cases, singleton children, and the desire on the part of parents to see their children grow up happy and healthy. And to me, this is an insight that's important for environmental educators everywhere. As we want to kind of cram our children's heads full of the environmental crisis and thereby motivate them to become environmentalists and engage in environmental protection. But perhaps that's not the most effective way to go about it. Particularly in China, we ought to be thinking about appeals to children's future well-being, their welfare, and their healthy development as a more effective way of encouraging parents and schools to offer their children hands-on nature experiences. But there's the last thing I'll say is, because I was quite impressed with Ashley's earlier point about, or his motivation when he's describing the genesis of the book, his motivation to, in essence, learn from Asia, a stance that I very much support and endorse. What's interesting to me about the situation in China and nature education and environmental education is how much those Asian countries are learning from one another. And kind of gets us away from this binary of sort of Asia and North America, and allows us to focus on how different Asian nations are contributing to this idea of eco-developmentalism internally within Asia. And that's certainly true with environmental education and nature education, with China learning from Japan, of all places, about how to do this right. So that's something that we definitely want to keep our eyes on. And I'll just leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, I have to add my favorite story, since Rob didn't talk about it. One of my favorite stories comes from Rob's chapter, where they take the kids and the parents out in a van some place up in the mountains outside the city, and then they separate them, and they take the kids off to one place, and they take the parents off somewhere else, and they tell the kids, okay, climb the tree. And you know, you don't have to tell your parents, right? Just climb it. And I really like that sort of subversive attitude, because the parents, of course, would never let the kid climb a tree because he might fall out and break his arm. Maybe we should go to Jingyun next. We should do this. We have happen to have 3 China and 1 Korea contributor here. So let's do the 3 China. And then
and also at the end, I could talk at the end too on Korea. Yeah.
Thanks, Steve. So first of all, congrats on the book. So excited to be here. Thanks to all the editors for your excellent work. I also don't have a story. I don't have an interesting story to tell, but I guess I will just introduce our piece, our contribution to the book. So Anthony studies NGOs in China. I study politics and activism in China. And we think environmental activism might be one of the most visible and important social movements in contemporary China. So in this piece, we look at how these environmental groups actually engage in local policy advocacy. So we outlined their major strategies to influence local government policies. So for example, we found these kind of groups are actually very adept at establishing interactive, stable relationships with governments. And at times, they're also not afraid to use the media to expose inadequacies in environmental governance. I'm not going to go too much detail in here, but I think this kind of on-the-ground information can contribute to our understanding about how environmental governance works in China. So I totally agree with what Professor Mary Alice Haddad just said, that environmental social justice is so hard to achieve. But I believe in order for the eco-developmentalism model to work, I think civil society groups will be playing a much more important role in the future.
Yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Steve, and thanks to all the editors, Lori, and everybody who I know in the case of my chapter made it enormously better through the closest reading that I think any contribution I've made to an edited book has received. So I hope the quality is evident to everybody. It's evident to me, at least the improvement. So actually, I did have a thought in response to Yves' question about the distinctiveness of East Asian eco-developmentalism in general compared to other parts of the world. Even though my chapter focuses on China, I'm going to hazard another answer. We've heard a few, that it's a particularly anthropocentric idea of environmentalism. It's and that might, if it has value for other contexts compared to, say, the North American one that sort of Ashley was outlining at the very beginning of his talk, we have a very colonialist idea of environmentalism where there's nature and then there's humans, and it's either something to be completely exploited or something that is just that we are damaging to and we have to keep ourselves away from as much as possible. And I don't know where Europe sits in that, probably somewhere in between, but East Asia is just the opposite. It's just, you can't separate these things. So much of the value of nature, and I think Rob's comments just now in his chapter sort of illustrate this, it's in the value of human life as well as in the value of other species. I came to that, if I come to that realization through my contribution to this, it's because it's about Chengdu and the Sichuan, it's about the Chengdu Plain in Sichuan, which is one of the world's oldest sort of continuously productive, densely populated, most stably urbanized to where it is urbanized places in the world, and really sustainably productive and intensively agricultural as well. So it's again, nature functions there, but it doesn't do so without human presence and innovation and adaptation at every turn. So I stories, lots of them actually, and some of them involve Steve because we did tromped around the place and did some of the field work together. Meeting with farmers who are trying to pursue an alternate definition of development for at their own family levels, almost regardless of this national policy now under Xi Jinping of ecological civilization. And I see there's a comment in the chat about that. So I don't know, is it appropriate to respond to some of the chat questions?
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. This is great.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, does Xi's ideological inroads under the concept of ecological civilization as a stage of development towards communism pose a risk to make eco-developmentalism exportable? And I'm guessing there that what you mean is that putting it under the banner of communism will make it less palatable to people elsewhere outside the Chinese context. I don't know, but it does, the way the question is put highlights an aspect of environmentalism in the Chinese context, which is that it has to carry the state stamp, the governmental stamp and the party stamp in particular, whenever it is being discussed at this policy or official level. And much as Jingyun was just saying, I share completely this belief that it not only to succeed and to the extent it will succeed, it will also involve much more civil society actors at different scales, and that it will not be purely a state project. But there is a tension in there, and I think it remains to be seen how that tension will be resolved and whether a balance can be found. And I think Mary Alice was making similar points in a broader way, perhaps. But yes, that's where I'm standing on that now.
I guess Chung Ho is next, right? Right, Steve?
Okay. I am Chung Ho Kim at the University of Seoul. It seems like I'm the only one from South Korea, so it's like I'm the representative of South Korea, so I'll do my best. Okay, first of all, I want to really thank all of you, such as the editors and then contributors and then the UW book, the staff, so everybody, I really appreciate them. So in my chapter, my chapter was based on my dissertation, so written in 2017 under the supervision of Steve and Dan. So thank you again. So in this chapter, I revisit the Korean New Village movement in 1970s, so which was a strong top-down political campaign for rural development, not the urban development, for rural development, driven by and implemented by President Park Chung-hee in 1970s, which shows the strongly high modernism approaches. So in this chapter, especially I looked at the first new villages, first 새마을 villages at that time, which were the showcase villages rather than the general villages. Interestingly, the main story was at that time, the President Park wanted to build the Gyeongbu Expressway, which was the first highway in South Korea, which was the main symbol of Korean modernism at that time. So, but the village was located near Gyeongbu Expressway. The government asked the villages and then demolish the whole villages, and then dislocate that villages and rebuild the whole villages through the pseudo-Western or pseudo-modern way. But interestingly, the villagers were very happy after they moved to new villages because the life quality was better than before. And then the new village was quite urbanized villages, and then the collectivity was also better than before. But it has also some limitation because the villagers and the villages started to be dependent on urban area much more, losing their self-sufficiency and then some independency. So I think the same situation is happening nowadays in South Korea, interestingly, even though that the Korean New Village was happened at 50 years ago. Recently, the president in South Korea announced the Green New Deal policy. So realizing 2050 carbon zero countries. So I think I noticed that the approaches and the mechanism is quite similar, even though the current government is quite democratic, relatively speaking to President Park Chung-hee in 50 years ago. So, but the other similarity is even though the government and the president emphasize the Green New Deal and environmentalism, but the main thing, if I look at the contents of the Green New Deal policies, the main thing is economy rather than environment, in my sense. So I think the economic sustainability is much more emphasized rather than environmental sustainability. So due to COVID-19, the government want to reboost the whole economy much more using this kinds of green industry and green businesses. So I'm a little worried about the new way of Green New Deal, but wait and see, and we need to look at the next step. So actually, so this is a quite eco-developmental approaches of South Korea. So that's it.
So I may add then the story of my chapter, which is comparative Japan and Korea. So you have a friend in Korea, Jung-ho, and this is actually a case maybe at least initially more described by Mary Alice as a contested case, right? This is a clash initially between the developmental state and civil society over environmental questions, environmental and food issues. So it's about genetically modified food regulations or the regulation of agriculture, biotechnology. And in both cases, Korea and Japan, there's a strong biotech industry that was very interested in genetic engineering. There's strong dependence on imports from the US. And so very strong links with the US and reluctance to do like Europe did and have a clash with the US. So the whole initial Iron Triangle developmental state is anchored into support for this technology. And then a few years later, lo and behold, both of them end up introducing exactly what the US didn't want or what business didn't want: mandatory labeling, adopting precautionary principle, signing the global UN treaty, the Cartagena protocol. In fact, China does it too, by the way. And Taiwan, of course, cannot sign the UN treaty, but ends up having its own transformation. So it's something that's happening in all the cases here. And when we unpack how this happened, there's really a clash that goes on. And the other side of the clash is civil society that organizes very actively around this issue. And there are differences in the cases, so I'll get to that. But the civil society ends up through linkages with local governments, similar to what we just heard in the case of China, and linkages through media. They end up having an impact on the framing of the issue. So they capture the framing and the industry loses that framing battle. And then public opinion shifts. And so then we have a real clash and we have a political process, a tipping point process, which takes different forms, but in general relies on open, fragmented institutions. So in the case of Japan, it was a time of, after the electoral reforms, of fluidity in coalitions. So we have partners in the coalition that are more pro-urban interest and pro-environment. Also, we have an interesting committee in the Diet, the Consumer Affairs Committee, where all the oppositions lined up. And then a key member on the LDP side in that committee sides with the opposition on this. And he's Kono Taro. who is now the, recently was foreign minister, defense minister, now is the administrative reform minister. Very, very important politician. But he's an interesting man. He came from Kanagawa-ken. He's close to the urban consumers. And he's very interested in health issues, in lifestyle issues, and environmental issues. So it's a case where, he broke, in a way with the classic lobbies and the Métis-Kedan land side of the equation. That's very important for the LDP. So we have that opening, which then the committee then orders the drafting of mandatory labeling regulations and the move toward precaution. And then is a whole grinding process. In the grinding process, then the ministries like agriculture managed to exclude the civil society. They don't bring them into committee. So the civil society was able to shape the framing of the issue, but not the final regulations, which are compromise regulations. In the case of Korea, the link became a minister, Minister Kim, Minister of Agriculture under Kim Dae-jung, who, by the way, spent time at UBC. That's how I was able to interview him after he stepped down. And he came from civil society, and he's very close to civil society. We also have, in the case of Korea, a very broad coalition, which includes agriculture, includes a religious group of Buddhists and Christians, anti-globalization groups. So it's a very, very broad, and it is a very vibrant civil society that's actually stronger, more vibrant than in Japan. Usually we see waves on issues like GMO environment. We see in Korea that those giant coalition with 21 members coming together, but they can't sustain over time because their resources are still limited. So they're able to get something done and then they dissipate. When they dissipate, then later the ministries that are opposed to going too far on the precaution can reassert their prerogatives. But in this case, the minister is the one who pushed through the system a big shift on trading policy, on mandatory labeling, and wanted also to ratify the UN treaty. He stepped down before that was done. So in the meantime, for 5 years, then the Ministry of Economy and Trade was able to block the ratification. So it was postponed. In the end, China ratifies many years before Korea. But so the net of those both stories, we see examples a bit of tug of war, negotiations, battle over framing with the media, battle over the openness in the system to create a chance for regulatory initiation, and then the battle for the regulatory drafting, which is more a grinding process. And the net outcome then is a hybrid regime where some of the ideas from civil society got integrated, and they get integrated into the developmental system, but in a compromised form. And I guess then we get ready for the next iteration. So it's a very interesting, protracted process that does look a little different from Europe. Any more stories? Steven, Mary Alice, is there any final point? Ashley, any final point for the editors, or do we go straight to questions?
I'm happy to go to questions. We've got a few tough ones in the chat here.
All right, so I'll go in order. They got upvoted, so I'll go in the order that we got. First, an anonymous question. What are the key differences and similarities in terms of the way the 4 East Asian countries have dealt with their own environmental issues? So it's a big one, actually. Who wants to take a stab at this?
I'll say one thing. This isn't one difference is between the big country and the smaller countries. That is to say, between China and the other 3, and that has little to do with the form of government, authoritarian or democratic, or when they became democratic, but simply has to do with self-sufficiency. Japan and Korea and Taiwan are all dependent for over 90% of their energy on imports. On fossil fuel imports. And so this puts them in a box that China is not in. China doesn't import energy. It doesn't, so I think this is one big difference, and it just simply has to do with small versus large. It does import oil, but other than that, it's much more self-sufficient than the other 3 countries, and this constrains the other countries of what they can do. the anti-nuclear campaign in Taiwan is so strong, but Taiwan is trying to develop renewables, but basically it's nuclear versus coal, or nuclear versus imported liquid natural gas more these days. So that's I think that's one difference.
I think another difference it has to do with the way in which the citizens work with the government or against the government related on these issues. In Japan and in China, one's democratic and one's not, but in both places you've had one party that's been in power for a really long time. And so if you're an environmental advocacy group and you want to get some stuff done, you have to work with that party. And so both of those places, environmental issues are not political, really. They're not partisan in any way. They're just, there might be local central politics, or there might, as Yves was talking about, there might be some partisan politics about particular small pieces of it, like bio, GMOs or nuclear or something. But on a broad sense, is climate change real? Nobody's fighting over that issue. And most of the time, the way that the pro-environmental policies happen is because they've figured out how to work with allies inside the government. And that has also happened somewhat in South Korea and Taiwan, but both of those places have much more active and hostile two-party systems. And the environmental groups have generally been lined up with the liberal parties. And so there's been especially in Korea, it's gotten even more so, where the environmentalists have really tied themselves, and they've decided that the way to win positive outcomes on the environment is to get the liberals into power, and then they can get what they want. And in Taiwan, I think it's a little bit more mixed, at least from some of the advocates that I heard. They had decided that actually becoming less political, less partisan, and trying to be a little bit more collaborative and do like policy reports rather than demonstrations was tactically maybe going to be a little bit better. But I think that's another difference between the systems, is that the way the citizens try to get policy actually done, there's variation across the four cases.
All right, I think that's good. Good coverage. Then there is the question, I guess, that will go to Ashley first, but then any author and editor. Why, relative to East Asia, is North America dragging its heels so much on eco-development and energy transition, especially in light of recent and continued investment in fossil fuels in Canada and the US?
Oh no, this was the question I was really afraid
Yeah,
some of
the Alberta man, Alberta man. Let's tell us.
I don't think it'll cost me my job. Okay, no, I'm not an expert of North American politics, but I have the sense that maybe we can go first to this visibility issue. I think for many people in these large North American countries, it's hard to see environmental degradation that can result in loss of biodiversity, for example, which Steve pointed out is this near permanent change. If you're in New York, you're not seeing or experiencing how fracking is playing out in North Dakota, how it's affecting economic life and social life, as well as presumably the environment. And you don't feel deforestation in Washington or Oregon in the same way when you're living in Arizona. It's just a very big country. And I also think that people are stuck in this notion that there's a binary situation between development and eco-development. There are a number of people in the United States in particular who are coming around to the idea that there's a lot to be gained from nodding in the direction of the environment, from having a green business, from making the environment a priority. But I still think that's not the majority, and the public has yet to really hold the political establishment to the fire over this. Hold their feet to the fire over this. I mean, we had so many Trump supporters, and Trump's a climate change denier. In this sort of a situation, it's clear that the public isn't behind this ego-developmentalism idea in the same way that is the case in these East Asian states. There's just a real difference at the level of public opinion, and I think this is crucial in these democratic systems. Without public pressure and with continued influence from some industries that are holding the U.S. and Canada back, movement towards making the environment more of a priority across the board is going to be slower.
I would dissent just a little bit.
You're dissent.
I think that maybe the East Asia, being ahead of the curve is in many ways more ideological than actual, biophysical. In the sense that China is still building enormous amounts of hydropower. They're going to dam the proposed 13 dams on a new river. They're talking about several dams in the Yalang Tsangpo. India is about to retaliate by building dams downstream on the Brahmaputra, which is the same river. They're still expanding coal capacity, although don't seem to be using it all. They're still expanding the capacity. And so in some ways, the forwardness of East Asia, and the same thing as I talk about Taiwan, how are they ever going to get to I think Tsai Ing-wen said by 2025, they'd have I forget what percent renewables, but pretty high percent renewables. They're not going to make it. They just don't have the resources to do it. So it may be there's an ideological commitment on the part of authorities. There's a general agreement among the public that this is what ought to be done, but I don't know if they're really ahead of us. Japan more so. Japan and probably Korea more so, but for both Taiwan and China, there are these, these physical constraints.
Mm-hmm. Would Mary Alice or Dan want to add?
I guess I would. It's too bad we don't have Joanna because she's really knows a lot about the energy. But I guess I think a lot of it has to do with the energy and fossil fuel in particular, and oil especially. And North America pumps oil, and we export it. And so there's a very large lobby in the U.S. and in Canada to support its infrastructure, its continued development, sucking it out of the ground, and our physical infrastructure in terms of lots of highways and lots of cars and giant houses all support that in a hard developed way. And so there are a lot of people who are like, oh, I can't imagine getting rid of my second car. Like, how are we both going to get to work if we don't have two cars? Whereas in East Asia, pretty much every drop of oil has to be imported. And a lot of it's imported from the Middle East and has to pass through Somali pirates and questionable dealings in South China Sea to get to where it is you're going in Northeast Asia. And so I think there's a lot of interest in all of those countries to reduce their oil imports in a way that we don't have in North America. So I guess I would put that as a determining factor between why the U.S. and Canada are behind the curve. And we also have a lot of other political problems in the U.S. and Canada, but I think that has a big role to play.
I was going to add one footnote to this. I was struck actually both Japan, Korea, and also China when doing interviews with policymakers on climate is really the ability to think long term, right? And I think at least for many policymakers, I mean, the case of China is now pretty unified because it has the approval of Xi, but there's very clear argument about 2035 or so, it will be a green economy. And so there will be no more combustion car. By the way, they're saying it will be illegal, right? They're going to stop all the combustion car, the new sales after 2030. And because that's what the economy will be. They calculated it will be that way. Therefore, we should be the leaders because it will be like high tech today, like AI, right? You know, and the rest of the world will wake up and it's dominated by China. And then, of course, Japan, Korea also. So there's this ability to make a plan 20 years, you know, this is where it's going, therefore then go with the backward induction. This is what we need today. And we don't do this, right? And so in a way, the signals in the rest of the world, especially North America, the signals are private sector signals. And they are a bit blocked today because we subsidize carbon industry. We still do, and we don't make them pay the pollution cost. And so the signals haven't come down to the private sector clear enough. Whereas the government in East Asia tends to add to the signals or amplify the signals and put subsidies as well. And so to really make it clear to the private sector, it's going this way, right? Maybe something like that. So
just to follow up on that, I heard in one of my interviews, I heard a really clear explanation of that, not just from the government side, but on in the way the private sectors are configured differently. So in North America, most business, or a lot of business, and especially a lot of the big business, funds itself on Wall Street. And so it's very, very fixated on quarterly profit returns. And that makes it a lot harder for environmental investments, which definitely pay off. Like, it's always cheaper to do your put insulation in a building so your energy costs are lower. Like, that's always cheaper. And they usually return in 3, 5, certainly 10 years. But a lot of North American companies have to show profit in a quarter or maybe 1 year. Like, they just do not have very long time horizons. Whereas in East Asia, most of the firms are family run or bank supported or government supported or cross shareholding. And so the long and the short of it is that they are able to have much longer time horizons in terms of the profit return, and they don't have the short-term pressure. And that ability to look further out is not just present in the government in the way that you were talking about, but also in the firms themselves. If you talk to Mitsubishi, they don't have any trouble talking about a 20, 30, 50, 100-year plan. I mean, their company's been around for a couple hundred years. So like, it's not, they don't have any trouble. Whereas if you talk to Ford, I mean, they might talk 10 years out, but mostly they're talking about, 1, 2, maybe 3 years. They're just a lot shorter. And I think that also has a lot, I don't know about the energy, but certainly on the climate issue is another reason why it's a lot easier for the East Asian governments and businesses and society to think in terms of, future generations.
Excellent. So then we have a China question. Does the civil society clampdown under Xi Jinping reach an impact? Will it impact its vibrant environmental community? Is there a risk of that, now? Maybe for Jingyun, right?
Yeah. So others also feel free to chime in.
Mm-hmm.
I think the short answer would be yes, because at the time when I was doing field work for this piece in 2016, the law that sort of cut off foreign ties, like foreign funding and personnel, had just passed. So the effects of that law hadn't been felt at the time when I was writing this piece. But now I know groups and folks are, having trouble with money, right? Because there's just little foreign support right now. And also, I think it depends on the kind of work you do, right? So I have contacted groups that are very focused on exposing, polluting industries, or like exposing inadequacy in government's, in sort of the government's governance. But I think those kind of work are more confrontational in nature, and that might be harder to do nowadays. But still, that said, I think the state still is putting environmental protection as one of its high priorities. And the state, especially agencies like Environmental Protection Agency, they still do sometimes want to do their work. So they need help and they need support from civil society groups. So I think that there's still room for these groups, certainly, yeah. But then I think, of course, the short answer is that I think the broader political environments definitely have an effect on how these groups are surviving.
Would Rob or Dan or Steven want to add anything to that? Yeah.
I could. My field work experience mirrors Jingyun's, I think. I would say I would use my answer to this question, though, to temper some of what Mary Alice was saying before about long-term thinking, because while it's true, for all the reasons that she spelled out, there are plans and policies that can think well ahead in China compared to a lot of what we see in the United States, at least. The actual performance requirements for local officials is 3 years still. I mean, they have to move on from there. And I've never encountered a local official who has to implement one of these policies who isn't first thinking about what he has to finish in 3 years. And that's a huge hamper. And one of the things that I have to think about right now is how much trouble they might be getting from non-governmental actors. So that often trumps the longer term policies or the large concepts of ecological civilization, for example.
Fascinating. Good. No one else? Take the next one. We still have the questions keep coming, so it's so good. Next one. In Europe, the urban-rural conflicting approaches to ecological policies are a major factor fueling populism. For example, the Yellow Vests in France, right, which started as a protest against an increase in the tax on oil, but generally a carbon tax. Are similar tensions visible in Asia? Very good question. Well said.
It's a great question. I mean, there definitely are urban-rural tensions, but I don't think they take, and there's also populism, but I don't think it takes the same form.
In Japan, we just saw those tensions this year over COVID, right? Where, in a way, and we saw within the LDP and Komeito and all this, the struggles, because the rural communities did not want to shut down the economy. They were very worried about this, whereas the urban areas, and we saw the Tokyo governor, Osaka governor, wanted to put health first, and so there's a conflict. But that's we didn't see that over the environment. I guess in Japan, solve is because there's so much public money, right? So it's never become a zero-sum game. But they haven't gone far. You haven't gone far yet on carbon tax. So carbon tax is the ultimate divider, which was the trigger for the Yellow Vests.
Well, one of the fun story-filled chapters is actually about local solar projects in Japan, and so it's about how local communities after Fukushima were able to use redevelopment money to try to do renewable energy projects. So one's a solar and one's a sort of like those small, not dams, but the like tubes that generate hydropower sort of in small amounts. Or I guess one was a small dam. So that's a pro-renewable energy in the rural communities. So it's not the rural community being against the urban communities want clean energy, and the rural communities are also getting public money to generate the clean energy. So I think it's at least in Japan, like you said, they've rigged it so that it it can be win-win. You can buy off the rural communities in some way so that everybody benefits.
You know, I was thinking about a related issue in Taiwan, which is the role of indigenous people in the whole environmental sort of politics scene, which is, I think, probably in a funny way more salient than any kind of rural-urban dichotomy, partly because Taiwan isn't very big, and you know, there aren't any really distant rural areas except for those inhabited by indigenous people. And that I wanted to mention this because there are 2 chapters in our book about this, and neither of the participants was able to join us this morning. But the indigenous people, of course, in Taiwan, as in Canada and the US, are very disturbed about the way that the expanse of resource colonialism, if you want to call that, you can call it internal resource colonialism if you want to, has made havoc with their ways of life and with the biodiversity and the resources in their own communities. But they have been able, I think, way more in Taiwan than in the US or Canada to join forces with sort of mainstream environmentalists and middle-class environmental groups who are able to sort of take and you might say, if you're really radical about it, exploit the position of the native peoples, of indigenous peoples, you know, and sort of romanticize them for the purpose of the environmental movement. But at the same time, the indigenous communities on the whole are favorable to this because they see this as a way of leveraging their very small power that they have, which is basically ideological, or even guilt, you know, playing on people's guilty consciences to gain some favors for themselves. But of course, it can happen the other way around, as one of our chapters by Langaman Robaniao talks about, where an indigenous community is in desperate need of a hospital and desperate need of a good road and a desperate need of a school building that doesn't have too many rats. And so they are glad to have the Taiwan Power Company store the nuclear waste on their land because you know, they're in a position of sort of desperate ecocide. So it's an interesting parallel to what you're describing for the U.S. and Canada, and I don't think it works the same way as it works with First Nations or with American Indian tribes, quite exactly the same way.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. We still have, very good questions coming in. So we'll try to take as many as we can. So a question from David. You mentioned that the countries in East Asia are learning from each other. Are there examples of where they're working more collaboratively with each other, but also issues that can get in the way? For example, I've heard that some South Korean people identify the source of their fine dust problem as coming from China, so blaming China.
Yves, you might be the best person to talk about that, because you look a lot at the sort of regional governance things and how they're working together.
So we see, at least there's a lot of declaration, right? We find those joint environmental commitments in a lot of all the meetings, because Asia has a lot of meetings, soft institutionalism. They meet more often than most other regions, but they don't have those hard shell like the EU. And there's a lot of discourse, shared discourse on environment that's included in there. There have been a lot of projects of Japan in China in the past as part of developmental aid. Many of them were environmental, just like for Canada. So that's that. There is a lot of joint research. Scientists have a lot of projects that cross. So a lot of collaborative research. They have those Asia, the Tri-Asia degrees and cooperation among universities. And there's a lot of environmental focus in those. Lots of theses being written and all this. So a lot of network, people power, people network, academic network, research network, very thick networks. Whether they leverage, they haven't yet, in the big conferences, they line up on the same place, but I don't think they have cooperated deeply.
The cities cooperate.
The cities, right?
Yeah, so the cities,
right.
like sister cities, and there's a lot of city networks where there'll be cooperative activity happening back and forth.
And there is clearly some blaming, right, in Taiwan and Korea and Japan for the pollutions coming from China. But at the same time, that doesn't stop cooperation. If anything, that enhances the motivation.
Well, the Taiwanese companies that do all their dirty manufacturing in China, so the pollution goes both ways.
Yeah, but it is an interesting story I was going to share, because there's really an interesting, they mutually understand each other, right? We always think, oh, they're so different, but, especially a regime, but actually there's deep understanding. I remember a story with an advisor to Abe, who was a former high-ranking deputy minister, on a more hawkish nationalistic side, not pro-China at all. But I remember he was telling me, I just see the new plan on cleaning up Beijing. I'm pretty sure they can do it in 10 to 15 years. I have no doubt. And I have a lot of doubt about China, but that I know they can do, because it's just like us. When we had the problem in the 70s, we're given the task, and we in METI, we did it in 10 years, and we transformed Japan into the cleanest place. So this is the same. We understand them. They have the same system as us. So there's that kind of understanding of the, how vision, how the tools of government can work. And so they can understand each other in meetings, right? All right, so next question from Weila. Will you say that China or other Eastern country is taking over the climate environmental leadership from the US or from the EU, I guess? Does China have the potential to reshape global environmental governance through its trillion-dollar project like the Belt and Road Initiative? And what is the implication for the US? Big question here. Well, quick answer while you're thinking, who else wants to jump? BRI has not been big on environment yet, right? There's only a small portion of it. Most of it is not clean.
It's anti-environment. I mean, it's big on environment in an anti-way.
Oh,
like it's building coal plants and highways.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Even though BRI 2.0 that's beginning now, it's supposed to take more of the green stuff. And I heard the Japanese voices saying they were optimistic about it. But at the Paris negotiation, Xie Zhenhua played a huge role, but not the only role, not taking over. It was together with Kerry, together with the UN, and with the French presidency. So it was a partnership. And it's, if anything, we don't see dominance, but we see climate is the one thing that gets the EU and China talking, right? For example. So it has a lot of soft power potential, but it's cooperative. China can't do it alone. But what would you like to say? Anything else? Anyone? There's a lot of brain power here. No? Take the next one. No, taking. So, what do you think, from Anonymous? What do you think about Taiwan? About how much Taiwan, I guess, is particularly for you, Ashley, maybe also for Steven, how much Taiwan has evolved on environmental issues compared to the time when you were living there? What have you seen in your lifetime?
I'd like to start out with that one, because I was living there around the time Ashley was born. And so, or maybe a little bit before. And of course, there was no, I lived there in 68, 69 through 73, off and on. And there was no concern whatsoever for any environmental issue. But even into the 90s, I remember writing in my diary when I visited in 91. I hadn't been there for a few years, and my first sentence in my diary the second morning I was there: Taiwan is garbage island. there was trash all over everywhere. And everybody, you know, if you said, hey, would you clean that up? And they say, why, right? It's other people's. And there was almost no concern. But then going back in around 2008 or so, or 7, and I visited a family in a village where I'd lived off and on and still go and visit, and an older lady. And they brought out a copy of my books that they had. And only the junior high and high school generations could read English. The older generations couldn't. But anyway, they turned it to a picture of the hills in the background of the village. And the old lady looked at it and she said, "Oh, right? It was so beautiful then, and now it's so ugly." And I think that there is, you know, I'm not talking about policies, I'm not talking even about, you know, factories or activists, but just the general population beginning in the 90s began, and I'm talking about rural population as well as urban, they really began to start thinking about what they'd lost. And, you know, it is the Ilha Formosa, right? I mean, or at least it was. And I really see a huge, just sort of sea change in the way people think about aesthetically and chemically and in terms of public health and everything, which is, you know, it's like everything else in Taiwan. It's you wouldn't have believed 50 years ago that Taiwan was going to have a GDP per capita larger than Japan and have a more democratic government than the US. And you wouldn't have believed that it would be a place where everybody had some sort of environmental consciousness either. So that's just a half century perspective.
Well, it's a magisterial account. I first went to Taiwan in 1991, and I had the same exact impression you did. It was garbage island. You know, I'd be hiking up trails like Xueshan, you know, go the ascent of Snow Mountain, and there was garbage to the left, garbage to the right. There's no concern about picking it up. There was an almost unselfconscious disregard for how things looked, and then there was the tremendous air pollution too. That was really bad. There were a lot of, you know, 2-stroke motorcycles still on the roads, and I was a rider myself, so we'd all, you know, get to the stoplights, and as soon as the light would go green, if you had a 2-stroke motorcycle, you tried to get out ahead of everyone else because you didn't you were going to send your exhaust back to them. You didn't want the 2-strokes out in front of you sending their exhaust back to you. It was just a time when the air was very filthy. Fast forward to the 2000s, and the transformation was evident. Air quality improved in part because a lot of Taiwanese factories did go to China. So the pollution was kind of exported in that way. And then there was a growing fusion, I think, of nationalism to this environmental consciousness. There was a view among many Taiwanese that this was their land, their home, a place that they needed to protect and cherish. And there's a growing concern for preservation of biodiversity. You know, whether it was the Taiwan Heixiong, the Taiwan black bear, which is kind of this national symbol these days, or, you know, this discovery that the Yunbao, the snow, the cloud leopard has reappeared, a source of national pride. You know, people thought that the leopard had become extinct, but one appeared, and that was, you know, the source of much joy. And then if you add, you know, to Taiwan's transformation, this support at the level of electoral politics and high politics with Tsai Ing-wen, you know, you really have politics, partisan politics driving this environmental transformation, with the DPP's victories in 2016 and 2020, you know, returning parliamentary majorities and the presidency for Tsai Ing-wen. She's really tried to move Taiwan toward becoming, you know, in her words during her inaugural address in 2020, a center for green energy in East Asia. She tried in her first term to commence the process of increasing Taiwan's renewable energy by about 500%. But as Steve alluded to, there have been problems with the rollout. That said, you know, I have the sense that there is still progress being made. In some interviews I was doing a couple years ago, I had one interesting story. I was talking to an entrepreneur who wanted to install solar panels in a wetland area in southern Taiwan, and he's convinced that he's doing a good thing as an entrepreneur, you know, creating energy from these solar panels. But he was encountering resistance from civil society activists who said, "This is a wetland. You cannot put your solar panels here." So it was interesting that there was this clash of altruisms almost with the civil society that had propelled the environmental movement, then attacking this entrepreneur who saw himself as altruistic, trying to create this solar panel installation. So one thing that I wouldn't want people to be left with is the idea that this process of transformation in Taiwan or anywhere else has been without contestation. Contestation's been a part of this environmental turn, but it's been one in which there's more to be won by being supportive of environmentalism in some way than standing resolutely against it.
Mm-hmm. I know our time is winding down, but I wanted to bring the question brought by Nora. It's very interesting. Do you see trends toward eco-gentrification, when ecological or green development leads to gentrification, displacement of poor and socially marginalized groups? Do you see this happening in the case studies here? And then she also followed up, in other words, is green capitalism happening in the eco-developmental states in East Asia? Yeah, so any thoughts on this? Very profound question. So I know oh yeah, so Dan, yeah.
Well, I actually answered, the first part of Nora's question privately, just because I know Nora from SCARP and CHS from my postdoc days at UBC, so send a shout out to her. But yes, and the chapter, here's a little pitch for my chapter again. But there is a little story in there about among the villages in the Chengdu Plain that is, you know, struggling between the desire to maintain farmers' viability, farming in the traditional ways amongst the irrigation channels, and the state's environmental protection of water quality by moving farmers out away from those channels. Some companies have stepped in. There's one sort of combination Whole Foods, organic food chain developer of rural resorts that has bought up a whole part of a village and has taken advantage of that need or that policy to relocate farmers, paid for it by buying up their houses and then turning them into weekend retreats and second homes for wealthy urbanites at enormously high prices. It's real rural gentrification, and then turning the agricultural land into a combination of aesthetic backdrops to those houses or actual fields that produce organic food, which they then market out of a kind of clubhouse and then put into the urban markets through their supply system. So it's quite a transformation, and I don't know how widespread it is, but there it was, right in our own field work site.
That's great, and I don't know if Lori, who is with us, would like to say anything before we close.
Well, I will just say one thing. I was the in-house editor, the acquiring editor at University of Washington Press for this book, and I'm just so happy with the way it turned out. It's, as Steve mentioned, it went through some rounds of revision and it got better and better, and it is so relevant right now with this recent xenophobia of various kinds concerning particularly China, but also other countries. And I think it's a great book for UW Press and for the world. But I wanted to mention that for people who want to order the book now, UW Press's website is offering 40% off and free shipping, I think until early January. So be sure to go to the website and order if you can. And there, for those of you who are outside of the US, there also is information about how you can order from other countries. But it's normally $30, so it would be only $18 in free shipping. Good deal.
And Steven, any final words? Thank you so much, Lori. Mm-hmm. Steven,
sorry, I didn't hear that.
Word as we close? As we close, would you like any concluding word? Mm-hmm.
Well, I just realized that we touch on a lot of things here, and I'm looking at the question and answer panel, and there's still a lot of really interesting questions that we're not going to get to. So if any of you have posted questions and feel frustrated or left out, just email any of us. I'm sure that we'd be willing to give you an answer in writing. And I'm delighted. I actually haven't seen it yet, but it's supposedly arriving in the mail in the next couple of days. So
I got my copy. Oh, it's not showed up. I have my copy. You can't see it.
Oh yeah, there it is. It's part of your. You have to through your garden gate there. But it's I'm just really delighted with the way it turned out, and thank everybody. It's been a very cooperative. That's the other thing. We haven't fought. Have we? I've fought with co-editors many times, but no, nothing of that sort. And people were pretty prompt in getting their chapters back, and we often asked for revisions 2 or 3 times, as Dan mentioned.
I second what Dan said. Very impressive process. There's no escaping it, right?
Well, and the other thing is a really international book. We have 3 Taiwanese authors, 2 of whom are indigenous. Well, actually, it's not true. We have lead authors. We also, one of the chapters has several authors, but 2 indigenous and several other authors from Taiwan. We have 2 authors from Korea, 1 from Japan, and 2 from Canada, and several from the US, and I'm probably forgetting some. So, China, yeah, right, China. Who forget about China? And Australia. So it really is an international effort, and it was fun to do for that reason.
All right, so it's time to thank everyone. Thank all the presenters. Thank the audience for your long patience, sticking with us a little over time. And have a great, peaceful rest of your evening, and stay safe and happy and green.
And thanks again to UBC for doing all the organizing.
Yeah, and thank you to Ross and Tim for joining this, and again to our 3 RAs. Yeah, thank you everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ross.
So
yeah, here is Ross.
Thanks, Yves. It was great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Ross.